how does the World Bank work on this kind of agenda, Kathy? Over to you. Let me give you this.
So thank you very much for having me. Just a couple of things to add to my background. I'm delighted to be here because I was co-opted by the World Bank out of grad school from the LSE 12 years ago, and this is the first time I've been invited back to London since I left, so I'm so excited to be here. I thank ODI for that opportunity. Yeah, that's the one, thank you. Sorry, I did a bit of tweaking of my presentation at the last minute. So thanks for the invitation. I'm going to talk about 5 things, and I think this is what Fletcher has asked me to speak about, so I hope that I'm right. One is why the World Bank might want to be involved in demand side of governance issues, social accountability issues. So I'll tell you a bit about what we're doing, why we're doing it, how we're doing it, and why we think some of it might be interesting and innovative. Second thing I'm going to talk about is the work that we actually have ongoing in the Africa region at 3 levels, both what we're funding, our knowledge work, as well as some of our partnership work. And then I think what Fletcher really wanted me to focus on was the evidence, and there's really 2 schools of thought in the World Bank on this at the moment, and I know David's going to probably say a bit more about that and how difficult this evidence and knowledge agenda here is. Finally, penultimately, what the implications are for development partners generally, and particularly for the World Bank. And then a couple of things at the end, just because I know Steve is here and he'll keep me honest, about what the World Bank itself must do as we kind of continue to evolve to make sure that we're consistent on this issue, on this agenda. Okay, do you want me to stop it, Fletcher? Yeah. Okay. So there's the 5 things I'm going to talk about. All right, so we have presented last April to our managers in the Africa region a new strategy, which I'm happy to make available to you all too, called the Africa Region Demand Side for Governance Strategy. And this recognises really that Africa is really a very changing landscape, as you all know better than I, by any of the kind of political measures, and David will tell you this, I'm sure off the top of his head, but there's many more democracies now than there were in 1980. There's only 3 fully autocratic ones, whereas in the 1980s I think there was 31 measured by Polity 4. So very different landscape in Africa. But we as the World Bank are set up to work with the executive branch of government. And performance of governments in Africa continues to be mixed, I would say, at best, in terms of results and achieving impact. And it's quite difficult to imagine how you can do that when you're only working with the governments and convincing them to reform when they're the ones that need reforming. So that's one reason why there's been a lot more interest in the bank on the demand side issues. How does one work with governments on the supply side, but also how does one build in some entry points on the demand side? Some other things that clearly the World Bank is waking up to is that citizens worldwide are demanding change, and people in the bank who are new to this agenda love to talk about the Arab Spring. This has taken some people by surprise, it seems. President Zelik gave a speech, which was quite an important speech last April at the Peterson Center, where he laid out the importance of citizen movements around the world. We recently, and I'll talk a bit about this in the end, have launched a new funding facility for social accountability, very much learning from DFID and other people's actions in this area. And we're just presenting this month to our board of directors a new GAC, which is a governance and anti-corruption strategy, which is this in its 2nd phase now, which points out that demand side entry points are an important new tool. And that's, I've already said. Okay, so now our focus in the Africa region is really to talk about how we're doing this through a number of instruments. I'll just give a quick definition here. For us in the World Bank, demand for good governance really refers to the extent and capability of citizens to hold the state accountable and make it responsive to their needs. So it's very much this kind of, when I came to the bank a few years, 15 years ago now, to the NGO unit, there was a whole lot of thought around empowerment and participation. So it's looking now at how to put that side of the evidence together with the side of the kind of supply side reform of the state, public sector reform in our definition. As Fletcher mentioned, we use the WDR 2004 triangle. We've made a couple of modifications to it, including, you'll see on the state side, we're now quite explicit about there being different types of state actors, including policymakers and politicians on the one hand, and independent accountability institutions on the other. And in our GAC Phase 2 strategy, we're also dividing citizens now into half so that we have both individual citizens, but recognize the legitimate role of social intermediaries and collective action forms. So in the Africa strategy that we now have, we build on this triangle, but we think it's a bit different for a number of reasons. First of all, we go to great pains to talk about what Fletcher has already mentioned, which is the context for social accountability and the need to really understand the socio-political, cultural factors that affect any process of change in any country. So you would imagine that triangle being surrounded by a context and being able to unpack that. We explicitly recognize, as I said, the role of social intermediaries as well as independent accountability institutions within the state. In Africa, the role of media and ICT is playing a very big role, and we recognize that. The penetration rates of not internet, but SMS in Africa are huge, which provides huge potential for people to be connected and to get information. And in our strategy, we have done quite a lot of work at figuring out where the World Bank niche might be. There's plenty of people who are much better prepared to do a number of things on the social accountability agenda than us. But we think that we have a comparative advantage in a couple of areas, probably not in the funding area, actually, but mainly on knowledge and on partnerships. And finally, our strategy recognizes that to be consistent in this area, we also need to change our own internal practices and behaviors. Slightly easier said than done. So, in terms of what we're doing in the Africa region, I'll skip through this quite quickly because I think Fletcher wanted me to get more onto the evidence thing. But we have a number of country-level interventions around the region. I'm happy to talk about any of those. We have people in all of those countries. We are using our country-level knowledge work much more than we used to. So, for example, if we produce a poverty assessment or a public expenditure review, we now believe that that piece of knowledge can be used to spur local debate and to build a culture of debate around good information. A lot of our interventions in the HD sector, for example, human development, social protection interventions, have got good impact evaluations, and we use those impact evaluations then to have a discussion in country about what needs to change. Oh dear, this is going the wrong way. We have a number of partnerships with important actors at the kind of global level. We have a partnership with the Open Budget Index. We have a number now with ICT partners. We have a number of partnerships with Oxfam and Revenue Watch around extractives, and we have one around procurement. We have, I don't know how many people are aware of this, but now all of our project information is disclosable. So we have third-party monitoring over our own projects. And we have, in general, we have this global fund, which I'll talk about a bit, called the Global Facility for Social Accountability, which is being launched next month. So, onto the evidence. What have we learned so far? So here there's kind of two schools of thought. There's the believers in the bank who kind of were doing this before there was much evidence, and they would point you to the evidence, for example, of the Japanese Social Development Fund, which has funded 220 grants to recipient agencies over the last 20 years. And their evaluation shows that the kind of obvious things, that disbursement rates are higher, results are achieved easier, you can reach disadvantaged groups better, you can deliver large scale easier, things are sustained more, and capacity is built when you involve non-state actors. And indeed, under the GAC governance strategy phase 2, we point out a lot of these things. We say there's 7 reasons why people should consider working with non-state actors, including the fact that they represent a broader public interest than just some elected officials, that policies and budgets are put into areas and services that citizens need. Tracking helps avoid corruption and leakages. It improves incentives for frontline staff, and all these 7 things that you can see there. So that's kind of the evidence that people who believe in this agenda point to. And there's some good evidence, and you all know the country studies that IDS and others have done that show that. But there's another school of thought, or another group of people in the bank who are particularly keen to see what they would call more robust evidence. And they're the people that like large quantitative data sets and like to do randomized surveys to be able to prove this. We've engaged with them a lot because I think it's good for them to push us on these things. And indeed, our chief economist in the Africa region, Shanta Devarajan, has published a paper with Stuti Kamani and Mike Walton, which shows a rather more mixed picture when you look at the quantitative evidence. Indeed, they couldn't find a lot of quantitative evidence, so they also pulled in some qualitative evidence. But on budget analysis, it shows that it can help citizens becoming involved, can help for a more informed and a better budget, but it isn't always the case. Same on participatory budgeting. They show that there is evidence that governments can be more responsive to the needs of the poor. But this is as likely about a new political relationship between states and citizens going on than the particular participatory budgeting initiative in itself. Voter education is a bit more conclusive. They show that it can help increase turnout and diminish caste and ethnic divides, but that doesn't necessarily in itself result in better policy decisions, of course. Report cards, quite mixed. There's the obvious cases of Bangalore in India, but there's also cases of where this has not worked at all. They were quite surprised, I wasn't, but they were quite surprised to find that community radio, they did a big, large-scale evaluation in Bain just last year, and found that it is not, the community radio itself is not associated with the ability of citizens to engage government more effectively. And of course, there's lots of examples of how community radio, for example, in Rwanda, has been used to spur genocide. Citizen report cards, there's the Bangalore example again, bit of a mixed story. Anti-corruption in the road sector, there was an interesting evaluation in Indonesia, which shows that the bottom-up approach to anti-corruption didn't work nearly as well as the top-down approach of auditing. And of course, they all point out that donors themselves have a role to play, which I'll talk about in a bit in terms of how we skew incentives and accountability. So in terms of conclusions, when you look at the evidence in the internal bank community, I think there's a few things to note. One is that I think, and the team that I work with, and there's a big group of people now in the bank who believe that demand for good governance, social accountability is just a welcoming rebalancing of the governance model. We were very supply-driven in the past, and to bring in this newer element is quite helpful. Having said that, I think that it's, I'll jump to my fourth point here, the demand and supply side interventions can't really be as separated as the World Bank likes to do in such a clean fashion, and that they're very interlinked and hopefully mutually reinforcing. And so this discussion about whether it's better to be on the demand side or the supply side for me is a bit of a false starter. But I think the DFGG agenda has that rebalancing. I think that demand-side governance can help to the degree that it can fix failures in political incentives to some extent. And if they're well designed, it will activate sanctioning mechanisms and accountability mechanisms on the supply side in the state. But to do that, I think interventions need to be really well designed. And by that, I mean that we really need to understand much better the context and the initial conditions within which we work. And I think we're all grappling with that, and it's an area which is not easy to get to grips with. I'll talk a bit about what we're trying to do in Tanzania on that. I think that development partners are not yet quite waking up to the fact that aid can and does distort, and donors need to be a lot wiser, including ourselves, about the political, social and cultural context within which we work, the incentives that drive the different actors that we liaise with in country, and understand the theory of change around those different groups. And I think we need to recognize, as my quantitative colleagues would point out, that scaling up of this agenda is really, really tough. And what you normally see is islands of success more than widespread success in this area. In terms of what we can do around knowledge, I think that Fletcher and ODI are off to a good start on this whole area of developing tools that combine both political economy analysis with theories of change. And I think Fletcher's recent paper on that is really helpful. But I don't think we're there yet by any stretch of the imagination. We're having a go at this ourselves in Tanzania. I'm just on my way back from Tanzania, where we're trying to look at the sector level of water and figure out what would be the best governance entry points for reform in the water sector, which has been a notoriously poor performing sector in Tanzania. And when you read Fletcher's paper and you look at the theories of change out there, you think, oh, can't be that bad. But when you actually try to do it, it's very complicated. So I think that's definitely one area that welcomes a huge filling of knowledge. I think the evidence gap and this discussion about what the best methodologies, this mixture of quantitative and qualitative tools, different disciplines, is an area where we need to work a lot more. We need to focus, I think, on exchange of of knowledge between practitioners a lot more. I think that we can learn as much from spurring debate between the people who are doing this as we can from the hardcore researchers that work at the bank or in academia. And I think that we can also use knowledge itself in this area to spur a helpful political debate in countries which is based on this evidence. In terms of partnership, there's 3 things I think that development partners could be doing a bit more of. One is that I think that the aid effectiveness agenda is in danger of limiting national accountability. In Tanzania last week I saw that very clearly. I was country manager in Ghana for almost 4 years, and I found that the debate was very much between government and development partners and very little evidence of it being down to citizens. Now, Alison and I were saying before this session, was there any evidence that there was that debate beforehand? No, maybe not, but I think that the fact that there are 25, I think, development partners in Tanzania at the moment, or with their own sector group, or with their own structure, or with their own reporting mechanisms, or with their own instruments, is only delaying the fact that that kind of reporting should be happening between governments and citizens. Second area is, I think that development partners would do well to figure out how to take a more of a backseat role and promote debate between national actors. We've had quite a lot of success in this in the oil and gas sector in Ghana, where we stepped back, provided information when asked, but really worked at building coalitions for change in oil and gas when they discovered oil and gas in 2008. And I think that's a useful model, how donors can provide information and resources to build national coalitions but not get in the middle of them. And then finally, I think the issue of how we use, and this is final one, is not at all a position of the World Bank, but I think there's a growing movement for it within the bank, that we need to get a bit more savvy about how we use specific governance indicators as preconditions for budget support and for investment loans. So, for example, President Zelek has said that any country that doesn't disclose its budget will not receive budget support, and I think that's a very helpful step in the right direction. I would also add that most of our projects should have a number of governance triggers that, if they're not fulfilled, shouldn't be dispersing. Finally, in terms of the World Bank, I mean, we're a big institution like many others here, and there continue to be a lot of internal bottlenecks, largely around our processes and our fiduciary requirements, and those need updating, and we've been around for almost 70 years now, and they clearly need updating if we're going to be working with non-state actors. There's the issue of institutional leadership in the bank. Governance and demand-side governance is an issue that kind of concerns everybody but doesn't have an institutional home, and the danger there is that it concerns everybody but it's nobody's business. And so, you know, people dabble in it in social development, in public sector reform. Our sector colleagues in water all have governance specialists, so that has a benefit but also a risk. There's always a danger in big institutions. I know this is true in DFID, it's true in the bank, that people will do it to tick a box and oversimplify the process. In the bank, there's a danger that this will become a safeguard issue, which means that people will say, oh, well, I need to talk to 10 people and show that I've had information flows downwards before I take my project to the board, and then that will be the end of that. There's the issue of, in the bank, the incentives being very much constructed around disbursements. At the moment, to do well in the bank, you need to take big loans with big amounts of money to the board, and then there's quite a bit of pressure put on you to make sure that those projects disperse. Now, there's quite a change with Caroline Anstey and some of the managing directors to look much more at results rather than disbursements. And as I think that happens, I think social accountability and people who are working on theories of change and making sure we understand the context for reform so they're effective will begin to get much more airtime in the bank. And finally, there's this issue of the Global Fund for Social Accountability, which will be launched at our spring meetings in, I guess, 3 weeks. Which is going to be the bank's first large chunk of change, really, that has been designed after huge consultations around the world for the bank to disburse grant money without any government input to non-state actors, which is a huge change for the bank because we're part of the UN system and we're therefore an intergovernmental organisation. So it's been quite a delicate process of negotiation with our board of directors. We've sent the board paper up to them now. I think it's going to be discussed next week. We had some very interesting comments from the Chinese and the Saudi Arabians on the draft board paper. But on the whole, I think it's going to go. And it will be very interesting to see what role the bank then can play around social accountability, how we do carve out our niche in this area, but more importantly, one of the windows for funding will be around knowledge. So it's much less about the funding instruments itself, but how the bank continues to use its role around knowledge and partnership, because I am one of the firm believers, and having come from civil society, I still believe this, that the bank's main comparative advantage is not in becoming the Ford Foundation or the Kellogg Foundation and giving out large chunks of change to civil society. I think civil society would not appreciate that anyway. But I do think we have a legitimate role to play on the knowledge side and on the leveraging space for actors at the national level and negotiating political space for people who aren't at the table. So I hope that this new global fund will begin to do some of that at the global level, and together with partners like ODI and DFID, we'll be able to learn a lot more about what works in which context and why.
Great. Many thanks indeed, Catherine. That was great.